Number 13, page 189. It's the last question on 3.2, so one would expect it to be a little more difficult. What they're asking us to do in A is to make this reflect in the y-axis and then reflect it in the x-axis, so two reflections. But let's skip ahead a little bit, and on B it says a reflection in the x-axis followed by a reflection in the y-axis. So I want you to think about, as we go through how to do that, this first one, think about whether the order matters or not. So when we flip something, we make it a negative. And when we're looking at flipping it across the y-axis, then we see that the x value becomes the negative. And when we flip it across the x-axis, we can see that the y value is what becomes negative. So basically, they're telling us to make x negative and make y negative. So the simplest way to do that, since they've given us a graph with points, is to just make a list of those points. So I've got, this is -1 and -6. I've got a point -1 and -6. I've got a point 0 and 1, a point 1 and 2. This is what happens when you talk and write at the same time. And you've got a 2 and a 3. So when we go over here, I have to flip it across each axis, so I'm going to make each of those values negative. I'm going to have a new point at 1 and 6. I'm going to have a new point at 0 and -1, at -1 and -2, and at -2 and -3. So when I go to plot those, I should be able to see physically what's happening with the graph. Now, 1 and 6, over 1, up 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there. 0 and -1, so 0 and -1. Wait, 0 and -1, it's there. -1 and -2, -1, -2, -2, and -3. So I can see from my reference points that it is flipped upside down and backwards, which makes sense, because that's kind of what we were trying to do. So I'm just going to try and sketch this in here, kind of messy through all this stuff. Gets to there, makes a little swooshy swoosh there, and away it goes. So it's flipped upside down, and it's flipped that way, which makes sense because that's what we were supposed to do. This would have, reflection in the y-axis first would have brought it over here, and then the reflection in the x-axis would have flipped it again. So then they say in B, a reflection in the x-axis followed by a reflection in the y-axis. They're still both going to become negative. So it's not going to change anything. They're both negative. These are going to be the points. This is going to be the end result. The question is, does it matter what order you do it in? No. And we can do that. This is a little bit sketchy graph, but we could do that in a simpler way by using a simpler graph. So if I used just your typical quadratic graph, and then I went to reflect it in the y-axis, so across the y-axis it would go this way, and then reflected in the x-axis it goes here. If I were to reflect it in the x-axis first, that would be this one, but then the y-axis would be that one, and oh look, it would be exactly the same. So you can see that it doesn't matter what order you do those in, it's just they end up the same in the end anyway.